In Quintus of Smyrna's account, Sinon endures horrific torture and mutilation at the hands of the Trojans, later reveling in his disfigurements as proof of his heroism. Now the character is back in the mainstream eye, thanks to Elliot Page's memorable portrayal in Nolan's Odyssey. In this video, I'll survey Sinon's evolution from mere signalman in the early epics to the despicable liar of Virgil's Aeneid, his grimdark later portrayals, through to Nolan's Odyssey. Stick around for some epic deep cuts from later antiquity. But I'll hold back the movie spoilers till much later in this video, and will give fair warning. Welcome to Ancient Classics. As many have noted, Sinon does not appear in Homer's Odyssey, nor in the Iliad for that matter, but it would not be fair to call him a late addition to the tradition, one dredged up by Nolan for the sake of giving Page a role. Sinon, it seems, featured in the epic Sack of Troy, or Iliou Perses, one of the poems of the epic cycle, and possibly in others too. These epics are generally thought to post-date Homer, but still are amongst the earliest known poems in the tradition. Most of the surviving traces of the epic cycle have been lost, so it's difficult to know precisely what role Sinon played in them, and we're reliant on possibly garbled summaries and inferences from later accounts. But it seems for sure that Sinon's role as the guy left behind with the wooden horse when the rest of the Greeks, those not inside the horse, sail off, is common to all versions, stretching back to the 6th century BCE, or possibly earlier. Apollodoros gives a simple account. The Greeks burned their tents and left Sinon behind, whose role was to light a beacon, and at night they sailed away and lay in wait at sea around Tenedos. When nighttime came and everyone was asleep, the Greeks came sailing back from Tenedos, and Sinon lit the beacon on the tomb of Achilles to guide them. Now, to be clear, Apollodoros does not claim to be summarizing any particular epic specific, and he was writing much later on, but Apollodoros is often where you go for the most basic Wikipedia-level source for Greek myths with no deep takes. So we can hazard a guess that the version you'll find in Apollodoros is perhaps the most conventional vanilla version, possibly something like what was found in the early epics before more imaginative poets had their way with the character. Nonetheless, Proclus's summary of the Iliou Perses, the Sack of Troy epic, which is admittedly written several hundred years after the epic itself, implies that Sinon managed to trick his way somehow into Troy before lighting his torch signal, perhaps from the walls of Troy itself. So, if we can take Proclus's word for it, it is possible that Sinon's more deceitful nature, an aspect that characterizes his presentation throughout the ages, was established right from the start. According to Aristotle, Sinon featured in his own eponymous tragedy, which is sometimes, but not by Aristotle, attributed to Sophocles, the great 5th century playwright. We know nothing about the play, but there must have been something interesting about the character, even back then, sufficient to justify an eponymous play. But Sinon first appears as a fully formed major character in the extant literary tradition in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid. In this depiction, Sinon allows himself to be captured by some Trojan herdsmen and is brought before the Trojans, who have already discovered the wooden horse and are suspicious, wondering what to do about it. Sinon spins a long, deceitful sob story, a ruse to gain the Trojans' trust. He claims to have been part of Palamedes' retinue. Now, Palamedes is often cast in the tradition, if not expressly in Virgil, as the arch-rival of Odysseus, and by some accounts the guy who foiled Odysseus' attempts to avoid the draft. Now, for the time being, I'll refer to Odysseus as Ulysses or Ulixes, which is the standard Latinized form of his name, and by which he's called in the Aeneid. After Palamedes died, the Greeks, and Ulysses in particular, persecuted Sinon, or so he claims. The sob-story builds and builds till Sinon is eventually sentenced to death, a human sacrifice to ensure the Greeks' safe return home. He escapes and flees before being captured by the Trojans. The Trojan king Priam is fooled by the sob story and welcomed Sinon. Priam himself ordered that the shackles and tight bonds be loosened, and with kind words says, "Whoever you are, you can forget about the Greeks. They're gone, and now you are one of us." I have more questions, though. Tell me the truth. Why did they construct this massive horse? Who designed it? What's the point? Some kind of religious offering, or a war engine? So spoke Priam, but Sinon, a man well versed in trickery and the sneaky ways of the Greeks, raised his freed hands to the skies and said, "O ye eternal flames, I call your inviolable spirit to be my witness. O ye altar and unholy sacrificial knife, which I escaped. O ye fillets of the gods, which I wore as sacrificial victim. Grant me now the right to abjure the sacred oaths of the Greeks. Grant me now the right to despise those men and bring to light all their concealed deeds. May I be bound no more by the laws of my homeland. But Troy, may you remain true to your promises and keep your word if I speak the truth and repay you with vital information." Thus, totally hamming it up, Sinon fools the Trojans with the yarn that the horse is an offering to atone for Ulysses and Diomedes' theft of the Palladion, the holy protective image of Athene. Virgil's Sinon proceeds to lay it on thick, claiming that if the horse is brought into the city of Troy, then Greece itself will fall prey to invading forces. Sinon even goes so far as to explain that the horse is so big precisely so that it can never be brought into Troy, and the Trojans fall for it. Through such trickery and the perjuring skill of Sinon, we believed his story. We were conquered by fraud and by fake tears. We, whom neither Diomedes nor Achilles, nor 10 years of war, nor 1,000 ships could overcome. So, with Virgil, we see Sinon established as a full-fledged, despicable deceiver, a reputation that the character has never quite lived down. But we need to be careful here. Note the narrative context. The story of Sinon, and indeed the Trojan horse, is told by Aeneas, once one of the foremost Trojan warriors who featured prominently in Homer's Iliad. Aeneas' hometown has been destroyed, his wife and many of his friends slaughtered by the Greeks. He is naturally ill-disposed towards Sinon. Moreover, he tells the story of Sinon and the wooden horse to the Carthaginian queen Dido, in whose court Aeneas is seeking refuge. So Aeneas has every incentive to paint Sinon and the Greeks in the worst possible light to win Dido's sympathy. And even, I might say, Aeneas is in the process of seducing Dido, and so has every reason to portray himself as the victim of trickery and deceit, rather than as a man who failed to defend his home and family in a fair fight. Thus, with Virgil's account of Sinon, we can never quite tell how much of the character of Sinon reflects long-standing traditions, and how much reflects Sinon's lies, Aeneas' distortions, and Virgil's own invention. We certainly can't trust Sinon's own backstory, though it is not clear from Virgil's text whether it is intended to be entirely fictional. However, the famous 4th century Virgilian commentator Servius claims to know the character's backstory. According to Servius, Sinon was the first cousin of Ulysses on his mother's side, the other grandson of Ulysses' dodgy grandpa Autolycus. I spoke about Autolycus in my video on Odysseus' origins, and I noted that in some sense Odysseus/Ulysses inherited his trickster, deceitful nature from Autolycus, and it seems that Sinon did too. Or at least he was written into the trickster tradition through a retrospectively constructed genealogy. It's next to impossible to ascertain whether Servius' biography of Sinon was true to the broader, now lost traditions, or a garbled misremembering. But one thing is true from a literary perspective, namely the relational proximity between Odysseus, or rather Ulysses, and Sinon. Whether or not the tradition had them as blood relatives, both descendants from dodgy grandpa Autolycus, it seems reasonably clear that Virgil intended Sinon to function as a proxy for, or doppelganger of, Ulysses himself. Ulysses' shadow hangs over the Aeneid, and Aeneas' story of the sack of Troy in Book 2 in particular, but he never appears in person save for passing references, a glimpse of Ulysses descending from the wooden horse or watching over captured Trojan booty. He certainly never speaks directly. Instead, Sinon acts as his proxy, and his words and description as told by Aeneas are rife with allusions and intertextual references to Ulysses as featured in the Odyssey and elsewhere. As Ganaban notes, like Ulysses, Sinon is a practitioner of dolos, trickery. Sinon seems to play a role in the Aeneid that Odysseus played in Homer. The Sinon episode also bears many similarities with Euripides' lost tragedy Philoctetes. In addition, Virgil's introduction of Sinon may intertextually recall Odysseus from early Latin poetic tradition. Aeneas tells us that Sinon is prepared to meet death or to spin out deceptions, versare dolos. In Livius Andronicus, Odysseus' famous epithet polytropon becomes versutum. Perhaps Virgil chose the verb versare to activate the association with versutum. Incidentally, I looked at that very opening line of Livius Andronicus' Odyssey in this video. Now, for many, this mendacious incarnation, Odysseus' darker shadow, is the definitive Sinon, and Virgil's Aeneas' possibly slanderous presentation of him seems to have dominated later traditions, sending Sinon even to literary hell in Dante's Inferno. But there is another strand to Sinon's characterization, a more heroic but also gruesome one that seems to have emerged in the centuries following Virgil. Time to introduce channel debutant Quintus of Smyrna. I don't know too much about our Quintus. He's usually placed in the 3rd century AD, a native of, no shit, Smyrna, modern Izmir. His only surviving work is a Greek epic known today as the Posthomerica, because it tells of the events of the Trojan War immediately after the events of Homer's Iliad through to the Greeks' voyages home, right up to the point where the retrospective tales of the Odyssey pick up. Maybe Inter-Homerica would have been a better title than Post-Homerica, but I don't get to decide these things. In Book 12 of the Posthomerica, Sinon is found by the Trojans near the Trojan horse. There's no elaborate ruse, he's just a Greek almost casually chilling on the beach by himself. Nor does he try to win the Trojans' trust by spinning yarns, rather he builds his credibility in a more horrific manner. They interrogated him, first with gentle words, then brutal threats, and then they tortured the crafty man over an extended period, but he kept resolute like a rock, and his body held out. Eventually they sliced his nose and ears off of his face, and they tortured him to make him tell the truth, where the Greeks had gone with their ships, what the horse was, and whether they were hidden inside. But Sinon remained strong, and he didn't let the horrific abuse get to him, enduring these beatings, terribly wounded by fire. For Hera had inspired him with great strength, and then amongst them he spoke scheming words of deceit. Only then does Sinon tell his tale, claiming, much like Virgil's Sinon, that the Greeks were going to sacrifice him, but he then fled to the sanctuary of the horse, which somehow was such a holy thing to the Greeks that they left him alone. Thus he manages to convince some of the Trojans of the horse's holiness to the Greeks. Trojans even feel a bit bad about torturing Sinon, so they invite him to come chill with them in Troy. So what Virgil's Sinon achieves through a complex fabricated pity tale, Quintus's Sinon achieves through his willingness to undergo horrific tortures and abuse. We encounter Sinon later in Quintus's epic, after the sack of Troy, now bearing his disfigurements with pride. They marvelled at renowned Sinon, because he had endured such horrific torture at the hands of the enemy. They honoured him with songs and countless gifts. In his brave heart he rejoiced in the Greek victory and did not grieve his own mutilation, for kudos is of far greater value to a wise man than gold or beauty or those other fine things, present or future, among mortal affairs. I should also mention the account of Sinon in an epic known as the Halosis Iliou, the capture of Troy, written by Tryphiodoros, who was writing perhaps after Quintus. The theme of mutilation comes up in Tryphiodoros' account too, but this time Sinon inflicts his own wounds. In thus describing Sinon, Tryphiodoros reintroduces some of Virgil's language of deceit. Sinon, son of Isamos, was left behind on his own, limbs voluntarily scarred with lashes, a deceitful hero, concealer of a hidden trap and a world of pain for the Trojans. Just like when huntsmen wrap a net around stakes, setting a trap for mountain beasts, and one man lies secretly hidden in the thick undergrowth on the lookout for beasts and keeping an eye out on the traps. Just so did Sinon, disfigured with his wounds, scheme grievous destruction for Troy, as the gushing blood streamed from his wounds over his shoulders. So why the sensationalist grimdark turn in the tradition of Sinon? Well, an intuitive and I guess knee-jerk guess would be that this is just a mark of belatedness. Sinon's role in the epic tradition was nearing 1,000 years old by this stage, and yeah, the literary innovations of the Hellenistic poets and Augustans like Virgil are now well in the past. So sensationalism is just the way things seem naturally to go. That or over-convoluted language. But at least Quintus and Triphiodoros wrote legible Greek. Now, I'm kind of resorting to blunt cliches here. What's perhaps more interesting is how the character and tale of Sinon, in his mutilated form, may have been inspired or influenced by an account from outside the epic tradition, from Herodotus, no less. In Book 3 of his Histories, Herodotus describes how the Persian king Darius was trying and failing to capture Babylon. And then this guy called Zopyros comes up with a cunning plan. He mutilates himself, cutting off his ears and nose, and then goes to Babylon, claiming that he was mutilated on Darius's orders, and therefore defecting over to the Babylonian side. It gets way more convoluted, and Zopyrus' efforts to build trust with the Babylonians are pretty extreme. He leads several sorties of Babylonian armies out to fight the Persian forces and kills loads of Darius' men. So the Babylonians are completely taken in by him and entrust Zopyrus with the keys to the gates of Babylon, and thus Darius captures the city. Could Herodotus' take of Zopyrus' self-mutilation have influenced Quintus and Tryphiodoros' depictions of Sinon, or indeed have influenced an earlier, now lost Sinon tradition? Maybe. It's a bit of a controversial take, but as Jones notes, it would be a gross error to reject out of hand the possibility that epicists like Quintus or Tryphiodoros exploited the tales of Babylon. Later writers frequently mined Babylonian legend. The history of this city firmly impressed itself on the ancient mind, and the stories at first associated only with it were implied to new situations. That Troy and Babylon would someday be compared was perhaps an inevitable consequence. So, I've briefly mentioned Dante, but otherwise let's skip the medieval tradition and fast forward from later antiquity to the present day and Elliot Page's Sinon in Nolan's movie. Let this be your spoiler alert. Nolan's movie, in one of the very first scenes, depicts Sinon hanging around on his own on the shore in the vicinity of the horse. And he rushes up to the wooden horse as a band of Trojans approach, only to be immediately speared to death in a now famous and unfairly memed shot. No elaborate capture ruse here. The depiction of Sinon just hanging around at the point of discovery is closest, intentionally or otherwise, to Quintus or Tryphiodoros' version of events. Sinon is wounded, killed indeed, but not at his own hands, and I think Nolan is unique in depicting Sinon's death at the point of discovery. Sinon's backstory unfolds throughout the movie, and he performs a key motivational role. I've seen the movie twice now, but given so many twists and turns, you must be aware that my own memory is an imperfect, unreliable source, which, come to think of it, is actually quite fitting. Like the Sinon of the classical tradition, and especially Virgil's, Page's Sinon is intrinsically linked with deception. But unlike Virgil's Sinon, Page's Sinon is the victim, not the perpetrator of deceit. The son of a poor Ithacan herdsman, Sinon was drafted into the Trojan War in place of the privileged, despicable Antinous, the very Antinous who is preeminent in standing and dick-headedness amongst the suitors of Penelope, the main bad guy, you could say, in both Homer and Nolan's Odyssey. Antinous' father promised to ensure that Sinon's father would be looked after and well provided for, but he lied, and Sinon's father dies in poverty, something that Sinon only learns in the afterlife. But that is not all. Odysseus himself lies to Sinon when he is left behind with the wooden horse. I must admit I struggled to follow this, but Sinon did not know that there were Greeks holed up inside the horse, and this was somehow crucial to his ability to convince the Trojans to believe that the horse was an offering. I really didn't follow that bit. Perhaps someone can explain in the comments what was going on there. But whatever, Odysseus lied to Sinon, it sucked, and Sinon died and is pissed off about it. In the movie's underworld on the Chaos scene, where Odysseus communes with the dead, and in so doing learns how he is to return home and the threats in store for him, Odysseus speaks to Sinon. Sinon reveals to Odysseus how he, Sinon, was betrayed by Antinous and family, and makes Odysseus promise to give Antinous his shame back. Then Sinon forces Odysseus to confront his own deceptions, crucial to the guilt and atonement arc that so characterizes Damon's Odysseus. This underworld scene has been met with a lot of controversy. It's well known that Sinon does not feature in the Odyssey at all, least of all in the underworld scene. And structurally, much of the role performed by the ghost of Sinon in Nolan's scene is performed in Homer by the ghost of Achilles, who does not feature in the movie at all. The switcheroo is an artistic choice made by Nolan, justified, I guess, by, among other things, the plot, because it's the key by which Antinous' deception of Sinon's family, a Nolan innovation, is revealed, setting up many of the tensions and the character motivations of the movie's final act. Perhaps Nolan felt that he needed to demonize Antinous just a little bit more to make sure that a modern audience would really hate him, and the Sinon plot strand helps to achieve that. And when Odysseus returns home to Ithaca in disguise in the movie, he goes by the name of Sinon, another Nolan innovation. And this is in part homage to Sinon and the other men that Odysseus has left behind, partly as atonement for his deception, but also so as to unsettle Antinous and to put him on the back foot, ready for the final showdown. Odysseus' adoption of the name and guise of Sinon is, I think, also a nod to the Odyssean, or should I say Ulyssean aspects of Sinon in Virgil's depiction, which I considered earlier. And what's also striking to me is how there are a number of echoes or parallels in Page's Sinon's backstory and the fictional biography given by Virgil's Sinon and by Servius, the Virgilian commentator. Now, as for Elliot Page's casting as Sinon and the whole culture war around that, I really don't want to get myself embroiled in the whole debate, but I have a few points. If Nolan wanted to cast a trans character for the sake of it, he had one hiding in plain sight in one of the very scenes in which Page's Sinon features. I'm referring to the prophet Tiresias, of course. My guess is that casting Elliot Page as Tiresias, who's actually played by James Remar, would have been too on the nose for a writer and director of Nolan's sophistication, and would not have been the best use of Page's talents, which are fully and very successfully deployed in my view as Sinon. Some commentators have made snide remarks about Page lacking the physical presence of an Achaean warrior, mocking the early scene where Sinon skips and stumbles over to the horse. But to me, the physical frailty and ungainliness of Sinon is part of the pathos of a manipulated, vulnerable character whose final heroism is to some extent unwitting. One of Page's Sinon's lines to Odysseus when he asks Odysseus to give word to his family is, if I recall correctly, "Feel free to elaborate a little." Some online commentators have mocked that line for its bathos, but to me, it's poignant and heavily resonant. Sinon never got to be the hero he wanted to be, and soon he'll die a less than heroic death, all in the cause of the Achaeans' final victory. And it's tragic and laced with pathos, and therefore sets up and foregrounds Damon's guilt-ridden version of Odysseus. And there's more. For a while, there were rumours, as I'm sure you'll recall, that Page was to be cast as Achilles, prompting outrage from many quarters and a lot of publicity. These rumours were sparked by the fact that the second trailer, released a few months back, showed a character played by Page in the underworld, prompting people to jump to the conclusion that Page was cast as Achilles. I can't help but speculate whether Nolan encouraged the rumours. Well, certainly he did nothing to quell them as far as I'm aware, until the final pre-release trailer clearly revealed Page's casting as Sinon. If it's true that Nolan allowed or encouraged the confusion, then it'd be kind of fitting that Sinon should, off-screen, be deployed in such a deceptive, provocative way. All in all, I really like what Nolan and Page have achieved with Sinon in his latest iteration. It's a fresh take on a fascinating character, departing radically from traditional accounts while still elliptically alluding to that tradition, primarily Virgil, of course. To me, that's the kind of sophisticated, knowing departure, drawing upon, inverting, but in so doing nodding to and respecting the classical tradition. It's a mark of a great modern adaptation. But what's your view on Nolan's writing of Sinon's character, what he's done with the tradition, and Page's performance? Let us know in the comments. And what about the medieval portrayals of Sinon, which I've omitted from this video? How, if he does, do you think Nolan engages with that aspect of the character's development? And like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon.